Hello, everybody. We will now have a side event called the UPR Implementation, which Professor De Stefani will briefly introduce in a short second. We would just like to remind you that this is still part of the simulation and you are still acting as your respective actors. So please keep professional behavior and have lots of fun with this exercise.
Thank you, Ronia. So this is a side event, as Ronia rightly said. So one event that takes place in the venue of the Commissioner for Human Rights in the Palais des Nations in Geneva, actually, organized in this case by a group of researchers. A group of researchers that did research on two states. One of them is very known in this model, Lebanon. The other one is Oman, another state part of the MENA region. So this group of researchers did an investigation into the human rights activities of these two states, what they have done in the past years about, in implementing the recommendations received by the UPR. In a sense, they have studied let's say the follow-up of your activities here, what you are doing now in Geneva for the UPR, in the working group and in the item 6 meetings. So they studied the situation in these two countries, and they are going to report about this topic from the viewpoint of a group of researchers. So they are not necessarily presenting recommendations that come from civil society or government, although the positions of government organizations and non-governmental groups are duly taken into account because they are the main, let's say, actors in the analysis of human rights policies in the respective states. Okay. So the first to present will be the group from who studied the situation in Lebanon. The second will be the group studying the situation in Oman. Both of them present at the end of their presentations a series of issues, topics that are mainly addressed to the UPR people at the UN. Concerns, suggestions even, and so on, that stem from their analysis of the follow-up of UPR procedures in the respective countries. So I hope this can be interesting. In any case, can be a good way to introduce the second moment in this afternoon, which is a question and answer session with members of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and staff of this office. And we are very happy to have today with us Mr. Mohamed Kheir. He will introduce himself later. And probably we will also be joined by the head of the UPR branch of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Juliette de Rivero. She will be online. So in this second part of this afternoon, that starts after their presentation, 5:30, the conversation will start with the questions that this group will propose and continue with questions that can come from you, from your, let's say, from the audience. Okay, I hope it is clear. Maybe you will also, summarize the next steps in this afternoon. Thank you again.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor. I will maybe summarize. So these last days, you, our peers, have been here actively participating in the academic simulation of the Geneva phase of the review. But our two groups are here today to present the other stage of the UPR cycle, which is the implementation stage, a 4-year period during which countries are implementing the recommendation that they have accepted. We chose to represent Oman and Lebanon, two countries that are currently completing their 4th cycle and must report next January. In the first part, we will present the results of our research on the implementation of the recommendations from the perspectives of the state and from the perspective of non-governmental stakeholders. The goal was to understand how these countries have been implementing the recommendations and to explore the legal, political, and socio-economical challenges that they were facing during this long period. In the second part, we will discuss the difficulties that we as researchers encountered, some of which were partially related to the UPR mechanism's characteristics. And finally, we will present the open questions and possible areas for improvement.
Okay, we're going to start with Lebanon. After submitting its third national report in 2020 under the UPR mechanism, Lebanon examined their 297 recommendations, of which it accepted 179. However, the fourth cycle for Lebanon was marked by political, financial, economic, social, and humanitarian with this crisis that affected the implementation of the UPR recommendations. Lebanese civil society is deeply concerned with human rights across various spheres of the situation and ask for state accountability. And meanwhile, the state may seek international assistance and understanding of its domestic challenges. The main topics we worked on were, as we see, the national legal framework, especially in the human rights, National Human Rights Commission, torture detention conditions, migrant and refugee rights, and the children's rights, especially in the field of education. Again. Starting with the National Human Rights Commission, in the last UPR cycle, Lebanon accepted recommendations to establish and activate its National Human Rights Commission, with progress reported by the state itself on legal amendments, especially related to budgeting and financial regulation. However, NGOs state that practical steps towards the operationalization of the NHRC have been very limited, forcing the Commission itself and their bodies to strongly rely on the NGOs' foundings for their activities. And due to these limitations and in resources, the Commission is forced to remain inactive despite its legal existence. And in response to this accusation or criticism from the NGOs, the state admits that the operationalization of the Commission is incomplete due to this various limitation of economic basis. But overall, Lebanon's commitment of the 2021 report, recommendations has yet to translate fully, especially in the human rights institutions, with ongoing legal amendments and reduced limitations and acceptance as a challenge.
So on the refugees' rights first, Lebanon said that they have this ongoing humanitarian assistance for Syrian refugees and also for Palestinian refugees now. And it also highlighted the adherence to the principle of non-refoulement. But when we were seeing the NGO's point of view, they were mentioning that, especially the Human Rights Watch, that thousands of Syrians have been deported, especially unaccompanied children. So that may not translate it. And on the migrant rights, the state reported that they established some standard contract reforms and support mechanisms, especially for migrant domestic workers. But even though there were these standard reforms, they did not change the restrictive legal regime that govern the migrants inside their country. So it's still very difficult for the migrants to be fully independent on their employers. So it's.
So regarding the fight against torture and detention conditions, Lebanon, during the beginning of the cycle, accepted many recommendations. However, according to the reviewed information, Lebanon has made no tangible progress in neither enforcing the anti-torture law or the UN Convention, nor in improving the living conditions in prisons. The local and regional NGOs state that prisons are still overcrowded. Numerous cases of tortures are still investigated by military courts and other security agencies in violation of anti-torture law. And almost 70% of prisoners are held in pretrial detention, where some of them spend years in the prison. The state, according to our predictions, will probably explain the underimplementation by the budget shortcomings caused by the severe economic crisis and the Israeli aggression, which disrupted most courts' work. Actions the state actually took and possibly is going to report on that in accordance with tackling overcrowding, the state organized a special court in one of the prisons to review detainees' cases and speed up trials. In accordance with the recommendation to introduce rehabilitation and social reintegration of prisoners, the Ministry of Justice, in collaboration with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, is currently implementing a special plan to transfer juveniles from the prisons to specialized detention centers. And they also plan on the implementation of the educational and vocational programs for these juveniles. However, we have to say that this plan hasn't been implemented yet. The Lebanese civil society has pointed out in their numerous reports that have been submitted for the next cycle the exact same recommendations that state failed to implement fully and effectively during the past 4.5 years.
And in examining children's rights in Lebanon, specifically the right to education, a research based on NGO reports showed that Lebanon continues to face serious obstacles in ensuring equitable access for education for all children, especially the undocumented children or the refugee children, which are like more vulnerable compared to others. And authorities acknowledge education as a child rights priority and claim commitment to improving access and equality in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Children. But the economic collapse, weakened public service delivery, and administrative discrimination, particularly, as I mentioned before, against non-Lebanese and undocumented children, create structural barriers that civil society has repeatedly documented. According to these reports, government action remains insufficient due to many reasons, such as financial constraints, limited public school capacity, and discriminatory practices that continue to block children's enrollment. NGOs argue that commitments under the UPR are not translating into reliable services and that the vulnerable children remain victims excluded from the classroom despite the formal policies. And there are some recommendations that has been made, such as shared standards for non-discriminatory school enrollment, regional frameworks for transitional and inclusive education, allowing learning continuity even when children are displaced multiple times, and funding mechanisms designed and managed at the regional level to stabilize and sustain education system under the pressure.
So overall, after we've done our research, we saw that most of Lebanon's implementation was either partial or uneven. And since the country has been facing a series of crises since 2021, which hindered their protection and promotion of human rights, and therefore also delayed their submissions and reports, which was one of the facts that we are going to bring out to you, that we thought it was a challenge on the state's part. But in general, there was a lack of progress and weak enforcement across all thematics that we discussed. But a good point, a good news is that this year we had an election of a new president and prime minister that since they stepped on, they have been underdoing what the previous government did. And they are, as we can see, they're trying to enforce and promote more human rights on the country.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the comprehensive analysis of Lebanon. Now we turn to Oman, a country facing very different but equally persistent human rights challenges. While Lebanon battles a Kuwait crisis, Oman operates under absolute centralized power, where the Sultan controls all branches of government, with no political pluralism whatsoever. Yet, paradoxically, Oman accepts more UPR recommendation than Lebanon. The question is, why doesn't acceptance lead to implementation? Oman's broad laws restrict freedom of expression, assembly, and association, leading to harassment and short-term arrests of peaceful activists and critics. Women face legal discrimination, and migrant domestic workers remain vulnerable under the kafala system with weak labor protections. These are not new challenges, but they are persistent ones. Oman has demonstrated increasing engagement with the Universal Periodic Review process. In its most recent 2021 cycle, Oman accepted 280 out of 264 recommendations, reflecting growing openness to international scrutiny. But acceptance of recommendation is only part of the story. Implementation is what truly matters, and that is what we are examining today. We examined 5 critical thematic areas: legal and institutional reforms, including strengthening the Oman's Human Rights Commission toward Paris Principles compliance, freedom of expression, association, and assembly, where broad public morals and cybercrime provisions restricted fundamental rights. Women's and children's rights, where legal frameworks remain incomplete despite progress in education. Migrant workers and labor rights, where the kafala system continues to restrict workers' freedom of movement, access to justice, and prevention of torture, where progress remains procedural rather than substantive. Like Lebanon, we examined state actors and non-state actors, including NGOs, human rights defenders, and international organizations. These actors often have dramatically different assessments of implementation. We will now present the key UPR recommendations directed at Oman, derived from international bodies and civil society submissions that target critical areas requiring further progress and implementation.
So for the recommendation part, I have enlisted the recommendations that are submitted to UPR by the Oman Center on Human Rights and Democracy and the Gulf Center on Human Rights. So first is freedom of expression. So in previous UPR, so Oman accepted 15 of the 20 recommendation on freedom of expression and noted 5. The recommendation refers to the amending the penal code, the telecommunication law, the public communication law, and the cyber crime laws. But whereas Oman has not ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, despite recommended by previous UPR cycles. Then we have freedom of association. Oman has accepted 8 of the 11 recommendation on freedom of association and noted 3. The Article 116 and 11710 of the Penal Code criminalize members of association that peacefully work through them to oppose state activities and policies. Then we have freedom of assembly. Oman accepted 10 of the 13 recommendations and noted 3. Whereas Penal Code Article 121 and 123 of the Constitution constitute a violation of rights of freedom of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Oman Center on Human Rights and Democracy understand that these provisions are routinely violated by the authorities to suppress peaceful gatherings and demonstrations. Then we have death penalty issue. Several countries have proposed Oman to carry out meaningful measurements to eliminate the death penalty law or implement or adopt the moratorium for the death penalty as a view to abolish the use of this penalty law. Then we have recommendations on the targeting human rights defenders and civil society activists. Of the recommendations, Oman has supported 2 recommendations and 2 are noted by Oman. However, the government has not implemented any of the recommendations. So civil society activists and the human rights defenders has been targeted. They have been imprisoned. They have been kidnapped, and many of them have lost their jobs. Then we have a migrant rights issue. Despite supporting the abolishment of the kafala system in the UPR, but this de facto kafala system still exists in the practice. As migrant workers are prohibited from leaving or changing the jobs without their employer's agreement. Then at the last, we have discrimination against women. The personal status law discriminates women on topics like divorce, like children custody, then legal guardianship, and the labor law continues to limit the types and hours of work women can undertake. Now we can discuss the state perspective and stakeholders review.
Oman now, while representing its 4th cycle of UPR, the focus is on major reforms that carried out in recent years to strengthen its human rights framework. From the legal institution reforms, Oman is highlighting the substantial progress in its legal system and the fulfillment of its commitments under international human rights treaties. The state joined several treaties in 2020, and at the same time, one of the key developments is the restructuring of the Oman Human Rights Commission under the royal decree. The state now is working on the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. From the civil and political rights, the state is focusing on major judicial reforms that are linked to its vision for 2040 and the Supreme Judicial Council for the years 2024 until 2040, the strategy. Now, there are also some legislative updates that include the royal decree and the reinforcing of the separation of powers. The state also noted the recommendation that it took from the Oman Human Rights Commission. In the women's and children's rights, Oman is stressing the progress in gender equality and inclusion. Women now serve in the judiciary, government, and in leadership roles. And as far as it concerns the literacy rates, now they have been increased because they are over 95%, and there is continued investment in education for children. The migrant workers and labor rights, here there are some reports on improvements in labor protections that are developed in partnership with the International Labor Organization. Some of the reforms include a better complaint mechanism for migrant workers, stronger monitoring and updates to labor regulation to ensure fair treatment. And to the last one, that we analyze the access to justice and prevention of torture. Oman notes the establishment of a national committee for the prevention of torture, and there is ongoing training for police and prison staff.
I will take after. I will go through the non-state views. And for the non-state views in the UPR come from three main types of actors, mainly the NGOs, the civil society groups, the national human rights institutions. I'll try to summarize because most of the things are repetitive. So one of them is the legal institutional reforms. First, the penal code, which is the main criminal law in the country, still criminalizes same-sex relations and even imitating the opposite sex. Secondly, we have the National Human Rights Body, which is the Oman Human Rights Commission. It's not fully independent because it has the B status, which means that most of the reports, most of the investigations and recommendations are mainly influenced by the state. But despite this, we note that there is also a positive development, which is there's a recent improvement of people with disability. And the decree is the one that happened this year that has tried to strengthen their rights and has also provided better support services such as health, education, and social program. Let's move to the civil and political rights. It still remains very restrictive. The 2024 media law gives the government a greater control over the media content. The broad laws on the public morals and the cyber crimes provision are used to limit the freedom of expression, including punishing people for their online criticism. There is also cyber crime and defamation of the laws, which are used to detain journalists, activists, and whoever wants to express their critiques online. So lastly, the civil society organization really face very tight regulations, especially when it comes to registration. But on a positive note, they tried to amend all that, but still they have not really addressed the major issue, which is the full civic participation and the freedom of expression. Let me give it to my colleague, Shil.
Thank you. If I'm to take you back a bit to the state's perspective, the state claims that it has actually put in place the gender equality mechanisms, and ladies are included in politics and education as well. When it comes to the stakeholders' views, ladies not really included when it comes to politics and all. If you look at the numbers, there are really few, and that's when you're really, really lucky or basically related to the king. If you're not, you have no chance. Then when you go to the inheritance part, it's highly likely that they'll really inherit anything from the parents in case of any demise or husbands, because literally women are property, comes to a man, and this is per the state, the stakeholders review. So when it comes to, there's a lot of gender gaps. When it comes to freedom of speech and all that, women are supposed to keep quiet. You're not supposed to say anything. So, and yet the state claims that, oh yeah, we have this implemented, but I think they still have a long way to go. Yeah. The other point is about the migrants, the migrant workers, about the kafala scheme, as my colleagues have actually stated. Workers, mostly immigrant workers, their passports are confiscated. The salaries are low. When it comes to access to justice, now let me skip a bit to access to justice. It's really limited. It's so hard to go present a case to court if you're a migrant worker, because clearly there is no way you can win, because all this is systematized, and it's really hard to have you heard. So in just a nutshell, Oman as a country has a long way to go when it comes to implementation of the UPR and all the recommendations issued to it. So I think I'll hand over to the next.
So conclude the human rights situation of Oman. As you people noticed that Oman is governed by the Sultan, and it is very easy for any kind of authoritative government to legislate regarding whatever UPR recommended them. But the crucial thing is that yes, we noticed the Oman is made a progressive step regarding to considering the UPR recommendation in their constitution. However, there are many things that we have to consider, which is the root cause of the problem, and prevent political activists, academia to not to work freely. The main thing is they limit the freedom of the expression, and they introduced a new cyber laws and defamation rules and the strict controls over the NGOs. So these are the main things that Oman political activists are currently facing. And the another thing is women and children rights. As they Oman implemented other areas regarding women rights, this and this, but the main thing is we noticed there is a zero political participation in the Oman in any institution. And the main thing is the migrant worker in the Oman are the most vulnerable group there due to kafala system. So they just they just confiscating the passports of the labor, which is totally hard for any labor to defend their labor rights or defend their simply basic rights regarding their labor labor issues. So the main thing which we are noticed is the related to justice system. Those who are activists and they are in prison, they face there is a system of incomunicado, yeah, sorry to, incomunicado, yeah. So there is a kind of they have limited access to the lawyers because in their legal procedure system is too slow. And this is the summary of the Oman human rights situation. But these things, create a huge and critical questions in our mind that we have to see these areas regarding the questions. And we have a group that who are going to share their questions with you. So right now we are giving them.
Okay, as we said earlier at the introduction, now is the second part is about the challenges or the aspect we discovered while doing our research. Starting with what makes the UPR unique. So first of all, it addressed all human rights issues. It covers the universal geographic region. So up until recently, all UN members were taking part in the process of review. Even now, after the unilateral decision of the US, the UPR is still the UN mechanism with the highest participation rate. It functions through the peer review model. So the states make the UPR recommendations and hold each other accountable that way. And the states under review can accept or note recommendations. So it's the ownership by the state on how to handle the recommendations. And the platform gives a stage to the civil society organization, and their perspective on human rights can be also included in the report for their country.
So just to give you guys an overview on what the two groups did, we did a research approaching directly both the state and the NGOs representatives, and we analyzed the reports that they already had it online or that they sent it to us. And even though we were able to get some of the responses, especially for the NGOs representatives, we, especially in Lebanon, we found it hard to find from the reports from the state's perspective and the information, especially from the state. The NGOs were more easy to reach and even to find it online. Yes, but it was overall, it was a good experience because we got the feedback from them, and some of them, like the Human Rights Watch, are going to present in January, so they already had it all done and they sent it to us. So here we have some open questions that we were thinking about when we were analyzing all this data. And we're going to give you some the issues, the background behind each question, so you can understand. The first one, the problem was that we faced was that each cycle, the recommendations kept coming and going, the same recommendations every cycle, because there weren't sometimes a real implementation on the part of the state. And in the case specifically of Lebanon, we clearly saw that most of the recommendations weren't fully implemented. So many of the stakeholders that we talked to are going to they're going to do the same recommendation again because there weren't it wasn't implemented. So for the first question that we have here, it would be, how can the UPR process be strengthened to ensure that recommendations do not merely carry over from cycle to cycle without real implementation? Since we've seen it happens a lot on our research. Can we say everything? Okay. The second question, what happened? I think the other group mentioned about the Oman, and to give everyone an overview about Lebanon, it is a democratic country, but religion and government are intrinsically intertwined. So that being said, Lebanese society is divided by three parts: the Shia Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, and the Maronites. And this division is evident, and it also shapes how the population thinks and how human rights are perceived for each of these religions, and which also means that their reports are not fully independent, and therefore, since they come from at least one of them. And what we brought here today would be how does the UPR ensure that its reviews genuinely reflect the rights and experiences of all groups in societies, like Lebanon, where religious divisions strongly shape political authority and social identity, and where this reporting risks being influenced by dominant perspectives. So how could we make it better? Because we have many countries like Lebanon that have this problem with the society being divided.
So the third issue, so according to the collected data, Lebanon held national consultations only in September 2025. However, under the UPR procedure, they should be held at least 1 year prior to the report. It should be well prepared to produce the holistic general report. We also couldn't access Lebanon's midterm report. We think that as it is a voluntary procedure, the state probably decided not to present the midterm report in the open sources. So our open question for that issue was, how could the UPR implementation phase, as in our perspective, the most important and the most difficult stage in the UPR cycle, the longest one as well, can be redesigned to be more effective. We were coming with one or two humble proposals for this issue. Like, for instance, maybe the state should create a national working group for that will be responsible for developing the special national implementation plan. This group should be also responsible for overseeing the implementation phases, preparing and submitting midterm report, organizing mandatory annual meetings. From our perspective, a national implementation plan for accepted recommendations should possibly be developed within 6 months after their final approval. The second option was more related to the UPR office. So it's like maybe organizing midterm and consultative meetings scheduled by the UPR office, but like on mandatory, it will have mandatory character. But of course, the open question is that would it change the whole character of the UPR mechanism? Would it then push more countries to just quit the mechanism because it will have more mandatory character? The other issue was also related to the thing that my colleagues already mentioned, that we couldn't get access to any reports or statements made by the national government. And so we think that it could also be related to the state-centered approach of the whole UPR mechanism that allows the national government to be fully responsible for the final national report. So there are limitations on checking the credibility of the provided information. And our open question is, are there any safeguards to ensure the credibility and accuracy of the information that is provided?
Thank you. And the fifth issue would be NGOs and national human rights institutions in Lebanon put significant effort into preparing and submitting their reports to highlight problems overlooked by the state under review, to encourage other member states to raise their concerns during the review, and to lobby the national state to accept UPR recommendations. But even if the UPR platform includes their participation, they still have limited access to the final version of the stakeholders report and the review phase of the cycle. And we came up with the open question of how can we make their participation more useful to encourage their activities and ensure their voices are heard. And as my colleague mentioned, our humble proposal is the stakeholder report could be analyzed by the relevant treaty bodies and used to access the SDGs, for example, thereby making their submissions more useful beyond the UPR system. They might participate in the online review stage and have one representative take the floor for 3 minutes. We have a technical question about how the summary of the stakeholders report is made. How does the selection process work, and who is responsible for the compilation of the final version of the stakeholders report?
Okay, so you people noticed they are asking regarding the within institutional reforms, how to we make bring a progress in our UPR implementation system. So we made a more broad question regarding the how we can bring a new to deconstruct the current UPR model and reconstruct again. So our question is more be relevant to the current UPR system. So if the UPR regarding human right violation. If the UPR functions more symbolically than substantially in Oman due to its lack of enforcement, does this threaten in the long-term effectiveness? Because we see in the short term, they bring reforms and they just, whatever they get recommendation from the UPR, and for the shortened period of time, they just improve their image to the international world. But for the real problems, it's remained the same. And the second question regarding to the UPR, as we know that UPR is based on the state consent, like there is nothing coercion or enforcement behind this. So given the UPR resilience on a peer pressure instead of enforcement, how can it encourage states to translate commitments into a real human rights progress? And third, our question is more broad regarding, we are in the stage of naming and shaming. So is it effective or not? If we, bring more changes, tougher our strategies, but there is also a concern regarding if we increase the pressure, might be there is a flashback from the state side. So this might be, kind of a threat for the UPR, our institution as well. So similar to how we can, our previous human rights body eventually collapsed. So these are the main questions that we are raised. It would be, yeah, good. So thank you for your listening.
So my name is Valerio Siciliano. I'm from University of Graz, and I have a question regarding the possible improvements of the implementation of the UPR. We have seen the example of Lebanon before, and my question regards the politicization of the process. Of course, there is certain human rights diplomacy that is serving actively some political goals. It's not surprising after several decades that this has been a deliberate goal. Let's remind of the paper, the strategy paper by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who already in the beginning of the 90s designed it as a geopolitical weapon. But this is only one aspect. Also, if we give credit to all good intentions, we have also another problem, which is what I would call passive politicization. Let's say a government that has agreed to implement certain things during one UPR cycle may change before the next cycle. So this is one thing that is not foreseeable by the government that takes on obligations. Therefore, I would call it passive politicization. And the other one is that the government of countries towards you have taken maybe some obligations may change in the meantime, and therefore you might reconsider some of the obligations taken. For example, we have heard in the concrete case of Lebanon, the remigration of Syrian refugees. It would be interesting to know if this happened before or after the regime change, because this could be a case of passive politicization of the process.
We can take 2 questions at a time. Is that okay for you, Julie? Yeah? Okay.
Great, thank you. My name is...
Question, by the way.
My name is Rose, I'm from Sciences Po, and my question is about the role of the involvement of the role of INGOs. So I don't know to what extent in your position you can hear and observe NGOs lobbying, so I'm not sure you will be able to tell me, but I'm trying. So how can NGOs be strategic and efficient in their lobbying to state? Because we've seen during the simulation that as a state, you hold the power. So you can simply say, no, I won't do it. So what strategy could NGOs do to be more assertive, to make themselves heard more than just suggesting?
Okay, so we should take these 2 questions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll start with the last one because that one's easy for me because I used to be the Human Rights Watch representative in Geneva. So that was part of my work. And I can say, you know, with confidently that NGOs do have a lot of influence in the UPR process and in lobbying governments to raise awareness about specific issues that should be raised in the context of the UPR and on many other issues as well beyond the UPR for the Human Rights Council. But definitely NGOs, you know, provide kind of factual information on situations and also help governments to tailor the recommendations that they make to say, you know, it would make such a difference if you could make these kinds of recommendations in this context and why it's important. And, you know, Geneva is a place where fortunately NGOs have a lot of access to member states. It's the only place in the UN system that really allows for such participation. So there is a lot of influence and many states appreciate receiving that information and being able to connect with the realities that NGOs are documenting and advocating on. So I think it is definitely a big influence in all of this. And for politicization, I mean, states are political animals and the UPR is not immune to the politics of states and the changes that come and that are natural within states. So, you know, we can see the geopolitical alliances as they play out in a review of a country. It's obvious. You can see the, you know, the disputes that underpin certain reviews because of, you know, bilateral issues that that affect a country. You know, all of that, although it's not the purpose of the UPR, but it still is there in the background and often shapes the discussions that take place. And but I think every government, regardless of what model of government it is or how democratic or not it is, they all want to look good in the face of their peers. And so to some extent, they all engage in some degree of politics in this. But I think, you know, the more the UPR has progressed, the more states are engaging genuinely and recognizing not just the issues where they feel that they've made progress, but equally the challenges that they face and the difficulties that they face in abiding by their human rights obligations. So I think for many governments, it really is becoming a more interesting conversation. So that's what I would say. Mohamed, maybe I'm sure you have something to say about this.
Thank you, Julie. No, I think, I mean, I perfectly agree. And I think that evidence to that, for example, we just had Libya's review. They had a delegation of almost 30 delegates from their government come from different backgrounds, representing different ministries, all of whom had very specific notes addressing the advanced questions that were presented to them in the weeks prior to the review, some of the issues that were raised during the previous reviews. When I look at the size of the investment that many governments are putting into addressing the issues at the UPR, I don't have the impression that governments are indifferent. It's true that there remains always many recommendations that are not implemented. And I do believe, however, despite this, despite even the politicization, and as you were asking, sometimes when you have a change of government that are quite radical, we've seen it now in some of these countries in the Sahel. We were talking about it with the professor, this group of countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, etc., that seems to have been all swayed by a similar kind of current, sorry. they also are developing responses and policies towards the human rights issues that have been addressed to them by the United Nations, by other organizations. So at some level, they feel the pressure. And I think that in general, you know, take, for example, the ratification of international bodies. When you have a change of government or a change of policy, states are still legally responsible to implement and respect the treaties, the international treaties they are a party to. So from a kind of international legal perspective, it should not change, you know, the commitments that governments have taken. In reality, of course, it can. It also depends, as Julie was mentioning, you know, some countries that change government and are affiliated more with this, you know, group of countries like Russia, China, Cuba, etc., they will tend to focus a bit more on social economic rights. They will tend to talk more about the right to development, education, healthcare, etc. They will tend to push back against, you know, issues relating to civil political rights at times. But they remain nonetheless engaged, which I think is the principal goal. With the one exception, every country has always participated to the UPR process. When it comes to NGOs and how they can be more strategic, for me, one thing is also when you have, for example, Julie before mentioned the coalition of NGOs in Brazil. We've seen it in other countries that, particularly some of the countries I dealt with, there was always a high demand for training and coordination. So we, you know, used to deliver a large number of trainings to some countries, including Lebanon, Libya, Syria, for example. Syria is a very good example. Syria, basically, under the previous regime, had cut all ties with human rights bodies, international organizations, but the UPR, they kept an active engagement with the UPR. We did, I think, 3 trainings before the previous government fell. Based on the questions that we were receiving from representatives of different ministries, they were knowledgeable. They knew what the international community was asking of them. They prepared, you know, some kind of logic or some kind of arguments for the positions that they took, even when they were contrary to what the UPR recommendations were calling for. And therefore, even in these cases, I think when you have a well-coordinated or when you have good coordination between the different NGOs, they can nonetheless optimize the pressure that they put. One of the issues that we frequently try to advise NGOs and coalition of NGOs nationally is to distribute a little bit the tasks among them. So at times you will see through the submissions, for example, that 80% of the submissions touch on the same 3-4 subjects, you know? And this is, I think, a relic from the past where there's a huge focus on issues like political detentions, you know, of course, mistreatment in detention, things like this, and a lot less to other issues. So we're always trying to encourage NGOs to try to be strategic, try to make sure that they cover as much ground as possible, and that there isn't necessarily an overlap on just 1 or 2 issues, but that they can try to exercise pressure also on these things that are important but less covered. And yeah, that's what comes to mind for now. Should we take more questions from, or did you want to go back to the?
We can regulate 2 more questions, and then
Yeah,
we can go back to the presentation. If that's
Thank you. Tatiana Voznesenska, University of Graz. Miss Julie, you mentioned on the beginning, answering the first or the second question, that there are some procedures in some specific states enabling tracking the implementing of the recommendations posted by the Universal Periodic Review. Could you please elaborate on that? Who is responsible for tracking the implementing of recommendations? Are there national institutes of human rights? Are there someone on the behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, Council, or who?
Thank you, Ms. Rivero. Thank you, Mr. Kheir, for this Q&A session today. I am Akshita from Sciences Po, Paris as well. I had two questions, but Ms. Rivero answered it right now. And Mr. Kheir, you also answered it about how NGOs are also advised by the in the UPR mechanism on their coalition and the strategies. My second question was, during preparation for the UPR process, we were looking at what are the strategies some states use in representing the states. And there have been a few instances where there have been almost propaganda-like strategies used by some states like Venezuela, where there were a barrage of positive recommendations made by CSO bodies. And I was just wondering if that was followed with China and Pakistan also presenting some similar behaviors in their UPR reviews. And I was wondering if following these instances, if there's any talks about, safeguards against such strategies being implemented by states. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
On the national mechanisms, very recently we developed a knowledge hub on the OHCHR webpage and on 3 issues: on ESCR rights, on the UPR practices, and also on national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up. So maybe you can go into that to check out the different models that exist for these kind of national mechanisms to track the implementation of recommendations. They're called national mechanisms for the implementation, reporting, and follow-up. And usually the model is a multi-state model where different institutions all play a role in the monitoring and have a common platform, usually a database, sometimes provided by us. We have a model database that they can use, where they can each contribute to monitoring the implementation and follow up on the implementation from their different areas. So let's say, in one country, the national mechanism will include a representative of Ministry of Justice, of Ministry of Women, of, I don't know, whatever, Ministry of the Interior, and each one has a focal point that can input information into the database of the national mechanism to be constantly documenting the implementation of different aspects. So there are, various countries that have now implemented such structures, and their different experience is documented in that webpage that I said. So maybe you can take a little bit of a look at that. I think, my biggest concern is when governments try to also control the NGO space. It's no secret that certain governments like to create NGOs to defend government agendas. And often these NGOs, known as governmental NGOs, so GONGOs, try to take the space that's reserved for civil society, including in the UPR process, to give praise to the government rather than, and so as not to allow too much criticism coming their way. And, it's NGOs themselves have to be very active to keep that space as an open space. So, taking the floor, signing up to speak, so as not to leave that space open for this kind of tactics. Equally, some governments do enjoy engaging with friendly governments to ask them to, salute certain areas of progress. But I think in most reviews, there's a diversity of perspectives. So even if you have a part of it which is doing that, not all of it is doing that. And so you can rescue some parts. And it's a reflection of the state of affairs in the country, really.
Actually, that covered everything. That covered everything. I mean, I think, look, ultimately, when it comes to states, you know, saying favorable things about other states, the UPR is a platform that, to a large extent, represents the dynamics within international relations as they occur. To the same extent, you can see sometimes countries being subjected to very harsh recommendations and commentaries because of, you know, things that sometimes go beyond the purpose of the exercise. You can see it, for example, when there are countries that have some kind of conflict with another country, they'll throw everything in the kitchen at the country that is being reviewed. I you know, perfectly agree that I think it's difficult to stop governments from weaponizing NGOs, especially in countries where independent NGOs can pay a price, or they are simply do not enjoy the same level of funding and support. They try to drown them out by funding their own. In a small way, it's kind of a measure of success, if you want to look at it positively. I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, you would have countries that would be completely defiant against anything human rights related. Many of these countries now, not that their intentions have improved, but they realize that human rights matters, and that their image that they give to the world will also in part be defined by their status of human rights. So the fact that they are investing in trying to weaponize some NGOs can be considered in some ways a step forward. Of course, this is just my view. Of course, it is also a threat because, like Julie was saying, this is a space dedicated to civil society. And so when it is being infused with political NGOs, it is essentially replicating, like the government is now also present in that space that, you know, should be dedicated exclusively to civil society. But I think the way to deal with it is to increase the voice of independent NGOs, as Julie was saying, and we also have a role to play. We as the UN, we as the UN UPR branch, we need to, and we have been having a lot of discussions with Julie and with colleagues about how we can maximize that, how we can engage with players, including at times academic institutions, by the way, that in many countries play a very, in Sudan, most activism started with the University of Khartoum. Many organizations are affiliated with the University of Khartoum. That is traditionally a hub of activism and independence. So we also have a role to play as United Nations to try to expand our reach and to try to get others involved who are, you know, who so far have been not included or haven't had the opportunities to make themselves heard.
Thank you, Mr. Kheir. We can call it 2 more questions if perfect.
Yes, thank you. My name is Britt, and I'm also a student at Sciences Po. And I think my experience during the simulation is that the UPR process for me is an inherently faulty process in the sense that it fails to address the political causes of most of the human rights issues that it addresses in the review, where states are justifying their lack of accountability with a lot of technical language or with a lot of minimal, low-impact interventions. And I was wondering, do you see a role for the UPR process in addressing political causes, or are you saying this is not the place to address them?
Hello, thank you very much for answering our question. I'm Sofia from the University of Padua, and I wanted to ask you about the decision that the US take to not participate in the next universal periodic review, and if this decision can make a precedent for other states, and if this precedent can be used to like weaponize the presence in the universal periodic review, if maybe some other countries can say or decide that they will not participate in the universal periodic review because and if some state participated or something like this.
Okay, I'll take the second question, and maybe Mohamed, you can answer the first question. If that's all right with you?
Yeah. That's
Okay.
all right with me. Thank you.
On the US decision and precedent, of course, this is a regrettable decision, and it does set a bad precedent for the UPR because until now we had 100% participation in the review. So, you know, it's a difficult moment for the mechanism. We've had this situation once before in the second cycle. It involved Israel, which decided to pull out and not participate in its review, and the Human Rights Council adopted a decision asking Israel to reconsider and setting a new date for its review, which is exactly, and saying that what it had done there would be a precedent to be used in future situations. So basically, that same model is what has been used in the case of the US. So the decision was taken to ask the US to reconsider, to ask the Human Rights Council president to carry out good offices to try and bring the US back, and rescheduling the review. So, you know, we hope that over this lapse of time, which is about which will take about a year for the new date, that the US does reconsider and that they decide to re-engage, which is what happened in the case of Israel. So they did, in the end, participate, and then, you know, that's how we've had the 100% participation. But it's true that we're in a very particular geopolitical context at the moment, and, you know, it's possible that the US decides not to participate, and that would be the first time that we are facing that scenario when a state is asked to reconsider and it decides not to. We also have the case of Nicaragua, which you might have discussed. They did participate in their review, but they've decided to disengage from the Human Rights Council because they feel that they are unfairly targeted by the Human Rights Council through resolutions that focus specifically on the human rights situation in Nicaragua. And therefore, they didn't participate in the adoption of the outcome of their UPR. So those are two countries. Israel has withdrawn from the Human Rights Council and has announced that. So it's possible that in the next cycle, they might not participate if they maintain that stance. So it does trigger, you know, a number of cases. But I think it's important to bear in mind that right now 190 countries are committed to engaging with the UPR, and that is a very significant majority, and that you know, the decision to withdraw from the UPR is a reflection of the domestic politics in many of these countries and what's going on there. But hopefully the US will see value in coming back. And, you know, we regret that the US decided not to participate, not just because, you know, it was a missed opportunity to review the human rights situation in the US, but also because we've lost the US as one of the states that participated very actively in the reviews, bringing up issues. So, you know, I think there's room for them to reconsider, hopefully. Over to you, Mohamed.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks for taking the hot potato, because For the first question about addressing the root causes, and you mentioned the political causes. What exactly did you mean by the political causes, if I may ask?
To give an example,
Yeah.
during the simulation, Lebanon was a participating state, and there were many recommendations regarding violations of children's rights because they've lost their access to education due to the ongoing conflict, and there is barely no mention of the Israeli aggression. And then thinking of Sudan, there is no mention of involvement of foreign actors. There is no mention of the size of the international extent and the international involvement in the conflict related to geopolitical interests, related to financial interests. Those are the main examples I'm thinking of.
Okay, now I understand what you mean. And that's a very good question. Thank you. Sorry, I was just not clear when you said the political causes. No, there are two things. The first is that when you have a country under review, the recommendations are addressed specifically to the government of that country. That does not mean that there aren't other countries that are playing a detrimental role, which is definitely, as you mentioned, the case in Sudan, in Syria, in Yemen, in Myanmar, many conflicts in Congo, for example. And at times it's by other governments, at times it's by foreign corporations, as in the case of Congo, for example. So the objective of the UPR is to address recommendations to the government of the country under review. But for example, when the turn comes to those countries that are playing a detrimental role, there is also the chance to address these recommendations to those countries, from refraining from, contributing to a conflict or from doing damage to a third country. I think that's something that can still be done, but just when you address the country that is doing the damage. Sorry? Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then there's also the fact that the UPR is generally a peer-to-peer exercise, if you want, mechanism, sorry. So generally speaking, unless there are tensions between countries, most countries are very cautious and very careful about the way they address others, because it is within their interest to try to maintain a constructive relationship with other countries. And so even when they do make recommendations, they usually, present them with these very flowery kind of, and we congratulate you for the submission of the report, which it's not that big of a deal, but yes, they always congratulate them on things like that. So I think the intention is kind of like diplomatic courtesy a little bit. And sometimes people think, well, actually the UPR is simply a public relations exercise, not much more. But I personally happen to disagree, because if you go and look at, for example, the findings of other bodies, from the treaty bodies, the special rapporteurs, NGO reports, and you identify the main issues of concern, and then you compare them with the matrix, for example, where all the recommendations are broken down, you will always find that the main issues of concern are reflected in the recommendations, despite the flowery language, despite the softball recommendations like please continue doing the great work that you're doing to promote this or that. And I think that there is a kind of general understanding that some of that language is simply diplomatic language. But then when you go and zoom in on the substance, most of the times, all the issues that have been raised by other bodies or by NGOs are there. The other thing is that we have also other mechanisms. So the UPR, ideally, works in tandem, in complementarity with the treaty bodies, with, for example, take countries that are under conflict and countries that are scrutinized by commissions of inquiry. The commissions of inquiry will, provide specific issues, usually relating to In the case of conflict, allegations of IHL violations. The independent experts will be, focusing on the substance of their mandate. And the UPR, I think, works in tandem with those. So you have governments that are trying to, be diplomatic, but when you consider all 193 governments, not everybody will be exclusively diplomatic. There will always be governments that will raise the real issues. And I think it works in complementarity, in a positive way, with those other bodies that are purely substantive and focus on just, issues of specific violations, etc. But I understand your point. However, I think that at the end of it, the UPR, in this sense, still kind of performs what it was created to do, I don't know, Julie, if you had additional observations or, yeah? You're good? Okay.
No, it's okay.
Is that address your question more or less? Yeah.
So since we have an active audience today, we'll say 2 more questions and then a wrap up. We have a schedule until 7 p.m. if that is okay with both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here with us these days and today during our presentation and answering our questions. And actually, I don't have a question. I have just a remark regarding this question about the war. My name is Evelina, and I was from the Lebanese group for the UPR implementation stage. So during our research for the Lebanese implementation of recommendations in different reports of NGOs, we saw actually their recommendations to hold Israel accountable, responsible for the aggression. And we were asking Professor, could they do that if actually the recommendations should hold the state which is under review responsible, and there is not it's not a platform to hold another state accountable. But then we stumbled upon one report of a particular NGO which changed the angle, the perspective, and they found the way to hold, in that particular case, the Lebanese government responsible. So their recommendation was that Lebanon has to and accede to the Rome Statute. So they will have the right to hold the Israel responsible for the attacking and for the violation in the International Criminal Court, which from my point of view, is a good example of a good recommendation.
We can call it 2 more. Okay.
I have another one connected to the role of the NGOs that was discussed before, and it was mentioned that some NGOs can be actually state actors which are masked as NGOs in the sense that they are established by the state, that they represent to make the state look good. But there is also another phenomena. I know personally someone working in an NGO, for example, that is concerned with Europeanization projects in Georgia and Tajikistan, and I asked how they are funded, and the answer was that they are 100% funded by the German Foreign Ministry. So there are also other NGOs which I hardly can call non-governmental, since they are 100% funded by foreign actors. That's also somehow also a kind of a background which doesn't justify it totally, but explains laws like the Georgian one on foreign agents. So these NGOs, like also the other ones that are established by their own government to make it look good, they all somehow can have the place to represent some civil society by pushing forward some interests which are actually very governmental. And isn't there some mechanism to identify the funding sources, because it's actually in some cases it's pretty easy. I will not mention which NGO I'm talking about, but if you go on the website, it's publicly written that it's 100% funded by the German Foreign Ministry, and it's still called an NGO. So I guess that there will be other cases as well where it's identifiable if they are truly non-governmental actors or if they are kind of masked governmental actors.
I don't know if you prefer to reply right away to that question, or do you want one more and then, okay, perfect. Do we have another question? I mean, we can stop with that question if you're okay. Okay.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think there's such a broad variety of types of NGOs, and it's very difficult to distinguish them. But I think what we need to ensure is that civic space is protected, so that the open space for a diversity of voices is there through civil society representation in diverse forms. And, you know, I think many governments that adopt foreign agents laws are trying to really restrict that space. But it's true that, you know, NGOs usually, NGOs that are engaging genuinely on human rights issues tend to have transparency about their funding sources. And many of them do not accept government funding for their activities. And they make that known, although people assume anyway that they might be getting funding from a government, but they don't. So I think what's important is to make sure that, you know, there is pluralism in the space for NGOs, and that governments don't overly restrict that space, because you know, it's very difficult to survive as an NGO in many countries. And so often NGOs may receive foreign funding for functioning, but I mean, the case that you explained is only one funding source, but in many instances, NGOs are receiving funding from numerous foundations, and that doesn't mean that they are representing the interests of that, of those different foundations. But I think it is important to protect civic space and protect NGO participation within the UPR, because unfortunately we have seen so many cases of reprisals against people that are engaging with the UPR process, trying to bring the real issues to the fore, and, you know, often putting their lives at risk because of that. So the issue of reprisals is protecting NGOs in general is key to the mechanism functioning as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. I think also, if you think of it, weren't there also governments leveraging similar accusations against NGOs receiving money from foundations like the Soros Foundation? And there were all manner of conspiracies as well. I think it's important that NGOs not be completely funded by governments, and particularly one government, because of course that can impact its credibility as well. But I also think that governments coming from Sudan, I mean, governments have a whole, you know, range of, you know, accusations against NGOs that say things they don't agree with. I think also for me, in addition to what Julie said, it's important that NGOs clarify the methodology of work. For example, many UN investigative bodies that were adopted by resolutions pushed for by specific countries that are known also faced different but similar allegations of like, oh, you know, these 3 countries lobbied for this mandate, so this body is basically serving the interests of these countries. I think one way to get around it is also for the NGOs or the UN commissions or any other body to, in the case of NGOs, there's a funding, so they should be transparent about the funding. In the case of NGOs and UN bodies, similarly, they should also, if they can, specify the methodology and give as much information as possible on how they managed to draw the conclusions that they did. And if anybody disagrees, then they have to make a case, that argues against the findings, the methodology, the analysis, etc. Instead of just saying, oh, these NGOs are, politicized and things like this. But I think that's a really good point because it's being raised now by many, many governments. In the case of Georgia, we're seeing it also in other countries in the region. Yeah. And about the first comment about Lebanon and the ICC, yeah, I think that's it's a great precedent because the ICC has jurisdiction also on not just national, but on, territoriality. That's the reason why they were able to indict the Russian president for alleged crimes in Ukraine, or now Israel for, alleged crimes in Gaza. So I think that's a very good precedent to give for countries to ratify the Rome Statute, because I think it gives them a measure of protection, and also indirectly it's a way of holding third parties accountable who might be committing crimes in the territory of the state under review. Oh. But that's me. Did you have any? Did we miss anything, Julie? Was there anything else you wanted to have? No?
I think we can close the questions. If we're okay with that, then I can leave the floor to Professor De Stefani for a couple of words.
Just a couple of words to say a big thanks to Madame De Rivero, of course. Thank you very much. It's the first time that we have you here in our model. It was really an excellent experience, and I hope we can replicate it next time. And again, thanks a lot to Mohamed. He's a connoisseur of our of our initiative here in Padua. It's always a pleasure to have you here. And thanks, of course, to the audience, to the students who participated in the model. Tomorrow is the item 6 meeting. So everything is ready. I think you submitted all your final papers. Tomorrow there will be the adoption of the final documents concerning the 6 states. That unfortunately I won't be able to be here physically because I'm busy with the graduation of some of your colleagues in other parts of the university. But there will be Mohamed and Professor Gerd Oberleitner from the University of Graz, who probably will reach us tonight or tomorrow. So thanks again, Madame De Rivero. Thank you very much. And yes, the last word is to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity and for the good exchange, and for all the work that you do to also bring visibility to the UPR. We really appreciate it. So thank you, and good luck with tomorrow for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone.